On today's show, we're talking hiring strategies, overcoming bias, and so much more with our friend Brian Lucas from the Cornell ILR School. Thanks for coming to the studio today.
Thanks a lot for having me, Chris.
Yeah, you bet. And thank you, audience, for joining us. All right, let's get right into it. But before we get into the tough questions, I want to ask you about some of the work that you do at Cornell. You're a professor, you do a lot of research, and it focuses on, you come from the organizational behavior, disciplinary area of things. Tell us about the work that you do at Cornell, because I think it's really interesting and probably not too familiar for a lot of people in our audience today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an assistant professor of organizational behavior at Cornell's ILR School. And the approach that we take to research, we call it what you would call the behavioral science approach. So we're focusing on the behavior of individual workers and focusing on issues about how they navigate the workforce. So for instance, some of us are looking at how people gain influence in the workforce. Some of us are looking at how we become better negotiators. In my particular research, I look at two topics. One of them is creativity. So they're looking at how people navigate the creative challenges in the workforce and looking for strategies to help them become more creative.
What kind of creativity do you encourage or look at, rather?
Yeah, so when we talk about creativity, what we're really talking about here is the generation of novel and useful ideas. So this could be what you might stereotypically think of as creativity, like, people coming up with a new product for their company to sell. But it could also just be any kind of innovation in the organization. So like coming up with more efficient processes, better ways to do things, things that can add value to the organization. And in my work, what I specifically look at is I look at people's beliefs about creativity and how those impact performance. And so I'll give you an example here. So in one of my papers, I look at people's beliefs about creativity over time. So if you're going to sit down and generate a bunch of ideas, do you think your ideas are going to get better over time? Do you think they're going to get worse over time? Or maybe you think they'll stay flat? And what we generally find there is that people think that their creativity is going to suffer over time. So we call the effect the creative cliff illusion, because they think that they're going to generate ideas for a period of time, and then they're kind of going to fall off that cliff, and the quality is going to decline. But we do experiments where we measure these beliefs, and then we actually have them perform these different creative tasks. And what we find is that their actual performance tends to persist over time or even increase over time. So we would call that a misprediction there. So people think their ideas are getting worse when in fact they're actually getting better.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's my experience. And then there's also a morality component to this too. What do you look at there? I find this interesting also.
Yeah, so in the same vein there, everyone wants to be good, ethical people in the workplace, and our research looks at the different ethical challenges that we face in the workplace and how people deal with those. So for instance, in some of the research that I'm doing that's being led by Zachariah Berry, we're looking at how people react when they learn that their coworkers have engaged in unethical behavior. So let's say that at your workplace, you have a coworker that you're very close to, you look up to them, maybe they're a mentor to you, and you learn that they have been engaging in unethical behavior in the workplace. How does that affect you as a worker? So Zach has put together this model about the psychological consequences of this. So the cognitive tolls, the affective tolls that it takes on workers, and how that can negatively impact their performance over time.
This is really cool work. And you're also a faculty member of a couple Cornell centers or institutes that we call them here. There's the Workplace Inclusion and Diversity Education, or WIDE, and also the Experimental Psychology and Organizations Lab. Tell me about those two, a little bit more detailed than what you just told us about your work.
Yeah, sure. And so first off, there's a number of centers and institutes around Cornell that support research. And typically speaking, they'll support the production of research and then the dissemination of research. So either to the public or within organizations or teaching it in the classroom. The nice thing about these different groups is they kind of break off different pieces of that puzzle and allow us to specialize in certain things. So for instance, with the Expo group, that's what you might think of as more of a typical research lab group. So the members of that group will get together, we'll discuss our research projects, we'll help each other improve the projects, maybe we'll collaborate with one another. And it's really about doing the research and producing that basic research that we can then use as insights within organizations. So for instance, the work that I'm going to talk about later today is some of that work was done in the Expo group and benefited from a lot of feedback in collaboration with that group. And then on the other side, we have WIDE. So that is both looking to further research and the dissemination of research. So one good example there is that WIDE recently created a research grants program, and my research team was lucky enough to get one of those grants. and we're using it to currently work on a research project that's following up the stuff that we're going to talk about today.
Great. Well, I thought that would be useful in understanding how you do your work and why you do your work, so that our audience, and frankly me to some degree, understands better about how can you fairly make recommendations about hiring, and where does that, where do those recommendations come from? So to set the table for the conversation, you wanted us to understand two key concepts. We were talking about this a moment ago. The dynamics at play in what are called informal hiring situations, and then the gender biases that take place as a result. So let's talk about those two things. Informal, what are we talking about?
Okay, sure. All right. So first, informal hiring situations. So these are hiring situations where, let's say you work in an organization, you are in charge of a new hire, and what you're going to do is you're going to mostly rely on your personal connections and your networks to help fill this. So you might sit down and write a short list of the candidates that you think would be good for the job. You might have people in your network referring people to you. So it's all about recruiting through networks and personal connections. And so this is in contrast to more formal recruitment channels, which would involve kind of formally writing up a job description, posting it on various recruitment websites, waiting for the applications to come in, kind of what we'd think of as the traditional way of recruiting people.
So when we're talking about this informal process, it's not necessarily binary, right? I mean, ultimately, we're going to get to a point where we're going to discuss the merits of having a short list, knowing some people, making connections, and also the formal processes. So just for clarity, right, the informal hiring process is kind of a healthy thing, right?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I think one way to think about it, too, is that you can think about a process with many different components to it, and some of them are going to be more informal, and some of them will be formal. So, for instance, you could imagine a process it's full of both things. So you have people going off, building connections, trying to get referrals, building the talent pool that way, and then you have the formal process that are bringing in applications through those formal channels, and then all of those things merging together. So you could imagine a spectrum that might go from fully informal all the way to fully formal, with kind of both of those processes humming along.
Yeah, it's funny, when we were putting our questions together, I kept finding myself, although I understand the limitations to it, the benefits of having an informal process. It's been my experience in life that life is about connections in a lot of ways. And full transparency, a lot of people on our production team are referred, that's how we get some of our best talent in here from a production standpoint, at least this part of our business, right? The people understand the roles, they understand the jobs, and boy, I have a person who's perfect for this kind of thing. This happens a lot. Any thoughts on that? I think I know what you're going to say, which is don't rely on it entirely, but talk about the continued benefits of an informal process like this.
Oh, certainly. And I mean, I think that would resonate with a lot of people's experiences.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if you think about it, if you're the one working in the organization, you're the one hiring for the role, you know the role the best. In fact, maybe you created it.
Yeah.
That gives you a lot of insider information. And
Right.
that insider information gives you leverage for thinking about who's the best person to fill this role. So you're going to have a lot of information there that people on the outside might not have, and that can help you locate some of the best talent for a position. So yes, a lot of hiring does get done that way, and it kind of makes sense. There's a rationale to it.
But there's some drawbacks. First of all, audience, I forgot about you. It's not just you and me talking today. Audience, we're going to take your questions, so drop those in the chat. I'll have them here, and we'll intersperse them in the conversation going forward. My bad on not mentioning that earlier. So there is, in these processes, the informal hiring processes, making the short list, operating in the way that we just described, turns out there's a lot of gender stereotyping that fits in here, or rather takes place, right? So we're talking about positions that are traditionally dominated by males in those roles. It's kind of built into this, right? Or you suggest, based on your research, that these biases are just come with the idea of a short list.
Yeah, certainly. So in the research that we do, first off, there are a number of different biases that are going to creep in here. I'm going to focus here on gender biases because that's what we focused on in our research.
Yeah.
But certainly, so when you're thinking about creating a short list for a specific role, one of the things is that many roles in organizations, they are gendered, and they have what we would call a gender prototype, meaning that when you think about who is the ideal person to fill this role, you're going to imagine someone in your mind, and they will probably have a gender. They might present more male, they might present more female, and a lot of gender stereotypes that we have in society guide those prototypes. So, for instance, we often associate men with physical strength. So when you imagine something like a construction worker, you're probably thinking of a man over a woman, or if you think about something like a police officer. And then we also associate men with technology, with science, with math. And you can think about the roles that are associated with those, things like engineers, STEM positions. Research has shown that when we look at the associations with gender there, we tend to associate those roles more with men than with women. And so part of the issue there is that when we're looking at this process of using these informal shortlists or these other informal recruitment processes where the people that make the list are just the ones that come to people's minds readily, if you are of the gender that's not automatically being seen as a fit for that role, you might not make the list simply because you're not coming to mind first. You might be an equally qualified candidate that's simply not coming to mind, and that's why you're not making these lists.
Good. So we'll get to how to fix that problem in a little bit here. So you caught my attention back months ago when we began talking. You co-wrote an article in Harvard Business Review. We're going to share the URL with the audience, by the way. It's based on your research that you do at Cornell entitled To Reduce Gender Bias in Hiring, Make Your Short List Longer. So tell us about the research in that article, some of the outcomes and findings that were associated with it.
Sure. Yep. And so the starting point for that article is kind of the observation that we just talked about here. So part of the difficulty of gender equity in situations where people are using these informal shortlist processes. So essentially the question is, how can we get the non-prototypical candidates to be more top of mind so that they end up making these lists? And we came up with a very simple intervention that we tested in this research. And the simple intervention was just to make the shortlist longer. And so there's a rationale behind this that came from the creativity literature, which is my other area of research that we talked about earlier. And the general finding in that literature is that when you're generating a bunch of ideas over time, those ideas tend to become more creative over time. So they tend to deviate from the status quo. They tend to deviate from the category prototype. And when you generate ideas over time, they become more creative. So if you take that logic and you move it into this context, in a context where you have a role that's maybe male prototyped, so people tend to think about men when they think about people who would be appropriate for this role. If you take that logic and then apply it, the idea would be that, well, if you just keep coming up with more names and listing more people, eventually those names should become less prototypical. So in this context, meaning they would be less male prototyped. So more women and other gender minorities in this context.
So you were talking to, the way that you did this is you sort of, I don't know if this is the right terminology, extracted the hiring manager from the organization and just sort of tell me about the methodology here, because I found this interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So what we're looking here, the phenomenon we're trying to capture here is really getting at the psychology of how hiring managers think about these situations. So because of this, instead of going into an organization and kind of checking out all of their processes and all the things that they got going on here, what we did is that we surveyed hiring managers themselves and put them into these hypothetical hiring situations to see how they would think about them. So across our different surveys, we would have hiring managers from a number of different industries. Based on the context that we're using, sometimes we would recruit them from specific industries. So for instance, I'll tell you about a study in the tech industry, and we were recruiting people with hiring experience in the technology industry.
All right.
And so I'll kind of walk you through an example of what these studies would look like.
Yeah.
So the first domain that we tested was Hollywood action heroes.
Okay.
Now, I know that's not a typical organizational domain to hire in, but what we were trying to do there was we were trying to look for a domain that had a clearly strong gender stereotype. And Hollywood action heroes are stereotypically masculine and male. And so we thought that would be a good context to start in here. So what we did is that we recruited participants and we had them play the role of a Hollywood producer. We told them that they're going to make an action movie, and we described it very stereotypically. There's going to be explosions, there's going to be shootouts, car chases, all of that. And what we wanted them to do is to come up with a short list of people who they thought would be good to star in that movie. And here's the specific protocol that we used. So we had them first just list 3 names. So list 3 actors that you think would be good to star in this film. After they did that, we had them extend their short list by simply just having them list 3 more people. So now we have an initial short list of 3 names, and we have an extended short list of 3 additional names. And what we were looking for here is, did the gender composition of the list change from that initial list to the extended list? And generally speaking, across our studies, that's what we found. So in our studies using the Hollywood action hero domain, we actually found that on average there was about a 33% increase in the number of women listed in the extended list compared to the initial list. And just to give people a sense of what that effect size would look like, so in the initial list, about 1 in 8 people listed were women, and in the extended list, that changed to about 1 in 6.
And you did something similar for tech executives. Nice to look at those numbers too. Can you tell me about that?
Yep. And so for these studies, we use the exact same protocol, but here we're setting it in a more typical organizational setting. So we're looking at recruiting for a tech executive position. So in our studies, we recruited people who indicated having experience with these types of hiring situations. And we told them that we gave them information about a hypothetical technology company. Again, trying to make it sound a little stereotypical, so set in California, dealing with new technologies. And we told them that they're trying to hire a new executive. And we asked participants to recommend people that they could hire for this position. And keep in mind here, so these are people in the industry, so they're actually suggesting real names here, even though it's a hypothetical scenario. So these are people that we could later on go up and look up online. And so what we did the same protocol there, where we had them generate a list of 3 names, then we had them extend that list by adding 3 more names to it. And we found a very similar pattern of results. So the extended list, what we found had 44% increase in women over the initial list. And so in terms of effect size, that's about a 1 in 6 women to men ratio, moving down to about a 1 in 4 women to men ratio.
Right. So, implicit, or rather the through line in our conversation, and viewer Terry asks the ultimate question here. How do you recommend communicating this to current hiring managers, explaining that we need to expand the short list, let's go for a longer list? How do you give them the why behind it? Well, this conversation's part of that, right? I think these articles are also really useful. So I want to make sure that we share these. These are starting points, but I think I recommend for anybody, Terry and others, is to check out these articles. It's a good sort of springing off point. We're not trying to solve these issues within the hour. That's a great challenge. But that's exactly what we were hoping to do, is to elicit further action and have our audience learn about this stuff. And of course, there's a lot of Cornell online certificates and courses that address this on a much bigger level, right? So if you're a hiring manager aspiring to become better at your job in every way, reducing gender bias, getting the most quality people in, those are 2 places to start. So I want to thank you, Terry, for that question. So we are kind of getting in prescriptive mode here. How do we fix this short list problem? So what do you recommend? What does WIDE recommend? And you yourself, Brian Lucas?
Well, so specifically to Terry's question, how you communicate it. So the advice I would give there would be kind of know your situation and communicate it in the way that you think would be most effective. So there's a nice aspect of this intervention, which is that adding more people to the list tends to just increase conversation around a wider number of candidates, which actually tends to be beneficial on a number of different dimensions. So here we're specifically talking about gender equity, but there are a number of different dimensions, such as other social categories or even just skills and experiences that you might want in a particular hire that's going to benefit from having that wider candidate pool. So for instance, if you're pitching this to a hiring manager, you could frame it as an intervention to improve gender equity, or you could frame it as an intervention to improve whichever these other things that you're trying to hire for. So I think that you have some flexibility there in how you're pitching this to others.
You have some notes here too about changing perceptions of the role, the job description, female characters, collaboration. Empathy is the big thing. Tell me a little bit about that. We had talked about this the other day when we were prepping this show. Any thoughts on empathy? I mean, this is huge. It's central to everything.
Oh, certainly. So this is kind of another class of things that we could do about this issue. And here it's kind of categorized under changing perceptions of the job role. So the idea here is if the job is thought of in people's minds as more of a male prototyped role, well, one thing you could do here is to try to change people's perceptions of the role itself. So for instance, you could emphasize the skills that would be necessary in that role and emphasize ones that are more consistent with the traits that are more stereotypically associated with women. So for instance, most leadership roles would highly benefit from leaders that are collaborative, empathetic, who can understand their employees. And those are traits that are stereotypically associated with women, but sometimes tend not to actually be put into the job descriptions of these roles. So one thing we could do is just kind of change the way we describe these roles to change the associations that people make with those jobs.
I've got an interesting comment that comes in from Andrew who says, I'm 53. I've had 4 or 5 careers and countless jobs. Only 2 I got purely from submitting the application, going through what sounds like he's identified, I think, the formal process, right? Not knowing anybody, having no connection to the company, no in, so to speak. Whereas every other job he's had, it's come from knowing somebody. How about the frequency of either people being hired through the informal versus formal? How do those 2 scenarios stack up?
Yeah, that's a really good.
We hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one, I think, based on survey data, it sounds like Andrew's experience is probably pretty common, maybe representative.
Yeah.
So one thing I will say is it's kind of hard to get exact numbers on these things, partly because these informal processes, the things that are happening behind the scenes, there isn't like a log where the companies are documenting these things, so we can't go back and look at the hard numbers.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a couple data points though that we can kind of use to get a ballpark. So let's start on the high side, more on Andrew's perspective. So if you look at surveys of employees and you ask them questions like, did your last job come through a referral, yes or no? You get upwards of 70% of employees saying yes to that question.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a lot of people are finding their jobs through those channels. I'll give you one on the low side. If you take, there was a survey that was done a number of years ago of employers, and it asked them the question, for the last position that you filled in your organization, did you formally post a job ad? About 28% of them said no. And so, so we're kind of at both sides. Now let me give you a number in the middle. So this number is actually coming from the research of J.R. Keller, professor in HR here that you've talked to on this show. So he did research on internal hiring.
Right.
And he was looking at the proportion of these jobs that are filled that have a formal job post versus are just kind of filled at the manager's discretion. And he found something a little over 50% of these roles were filled at the manager's discretion with no formal job posting made. So we have a range of numbers here from about a quarter to about 3/4 of people, kind of reporting these things. I think the takeaway from that is that, for me at least, is the answer is certainly not 0.
Yeah.
The answer seems probably significantly higher than that. So when we ask like how prevalent are these practices, I think it's a little hard to put an exact number on it, but I think we can say that they're prevalent enough that they matter.
I'm so glad you mentioned the J.R. Keller interview. So that is a companion keynote to this. I hadn't planned on it, but maybe our team can do this behind the scenes. It's called Internal Talent Mobility, and it's about the very thing you described. And I'm so glad you brought it up because that's another dynamic that we didn't really talk about. Internal versus external hires. Where do you get the strongest stuff? Are you missing out? Internal hiring is advisable, but you're missing out on all this potential talent outside and breadth of experience and all the other things that can be brought to a job.
Oh, certainly. And I think that's also one area that tends to get overlooked when we think about trying to reduce the biases in our hiring systems. So one, internal hires, internal promotions, those types of things, those aren't regulated by any kind of requirements to post job ads or to follow any particular processes. And I'm sure as many people who have been in those roles probably know, sometimes there isn't a whole lot of formality to it. Sometimes it literally might just be one person's preferences driving the process, no matter how unbiased they're trying to be about it.
I know someone who's in technical sales and he hasn't had a resume for 20 years, and he switches jobs every 8 to 12 months or something like that. But that's just the nature of that particular lane that he rides in. So let's get back to actionable next steps for our viewers. This is something that I think is useful. It kind of relates to what Terry was getting at, right? Like, how do I turn around and make the case for this? Are there things that HR pros or people or hiring managers can do to bring these practices into their work? Because we talked about this before, and this comes up almost in every workforce-related interview that we do, which is a lot of people aren't trained on interviewing or doing this stuff. We don't typically have, outside of the human resources umbrella, people that are actually trained to do interviews. So for the people that are on the hiring manager side, building teams or whatever, you had mentioned something called the Advanced Pathway Audit. What's that about? This is cool.
Yeah, so the Advancement Pathway Audit. So this is an exercise that I encourage particularly hiring managers to go through, but actually anyone working in an organization could do this. So this is something that you would do on your own. Maybe you could do it with a trusted colleague that can, kind of check your information and make sure you're doing it honestly for yourself. But essentially what you're going to do here is you're going to just make a list of all of the advancement pathways in your organization over which you have some amount of control or influence. And so there are kind of typical examples of this, like if you're a manager and you're hiring an employee to work for you, that's a pretty typical example of having control over an advancement pathway. But there are also a lot of other ones that we tend not to think of so much. So for instance, you have control over promotions. You have control over who gets recommended for different types of training, who gets recommended for high-profile projects. And even if you're not a manager, let's say you're an entry-level employee, you still have some control over these advancement pathways in that at some point you will probably provide ratings for your teammates, like maybe as part of a 360-degree survey. And so your input does matter for these other people. So what you should do is you're making a list of all of these ways that you have control over advancement pathways. And then what you're doing is that you're auditing it to think about different ways that bias might be creeping into those evaluations. So for instance, you could think about whether gender stereotypes are playing a role here. Mm-hmm. So for example, I heard one story about someone who was thinking about which of their employees to promote to the next level. And they learned that when they got promoted to the next level, that job would require a lot more travel, so a lot more travel than the current role. Mm-hmm. And one thing that this person was doing is that they weren't considering the female candidates as much because they assumed that they would want to be home with their families and not travel.
Okay.
So, just ways there that I don't think that they were intending to be biased, but just ways that those stereotypes lead bias to creep into those decisions. And so that's really what you're trying to do mm-hmm. with this advancement pathways audit, is just to really be blunt about the places that you have control over other people or influence over other people's advancement, and being honest with yourself about whether or not biases might be creeping into those.
Perfect. We have a viewer question. You and I were talking about this a little bit before the show. Jordan asks, I'm curious, when extending the shortlist, building a longer list, did you notice the increase in non-cis recommendations for roles? We were talking about transgender people and otherwise, or were recommendations still cis-binary? And you had kind of made a distinction in the research. Here's what we were looking at. Here are the dynamics. Can you explain that a little bit? Because if my takeaway was males and everybody else, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the methodology of how we categorize those things. So in our typical study, we would have people just making lists of recommendations. So particularly for the Hollywood action heroes, for the tech CEOs, these were people that we could actually go look them up and figure out how they present themselves. So they might be presented as male, female, or a different gender minority, and we could count those up. And essentially what we found is that there was about less than 1% of what we categorize as other gender minority categories. So for instance, transgender, non-binary. Mm-hmm. And really that's just not enough data to draw conclusions from those groups. So I don't think empirically we can't say that there was different or similar amounts of bias just because there wasn't enough data there. But if we step back, though, and think about theoretically what we would expect based on what we're proposing here, what we're proposing is that some of these roles have, for instance, male prototypes, and the people who fit that role are going to get benefited, and the people that don't fit the role are not going to get benefited. And so in that way, you might expect women and other gender minorities to just receive a similar amount of not coming to mind as compared to a man for a male prototyped role.
I hope I'm not inching out of your purview here, but Laura asked a question. Let's see if we can hit it. What are your thoughts on moving to a skills-based model of hiring versus experience-based in order to expand the shortlist? Is that a binary situation right there? I mean, do you have to do one or the other? What do you think about that question?
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's a good idea to think about the different types of attributes that you would want to be selecting on, and try to find ones that are probably the most diagnostic of performance in the job, or perhaps least diagnostic of perhaps someone's background or where they might be coming from. And so I think that I would say that it's probably not a right or wrong. It's more just about looking at what the requirements of that specific role are and seeing if it makes sense to do that. But certainly anything that can become less disentangled with perhaps someone's, for instance, gender or the stereotypes around gender, certainly I could imagine that helping.
So let me ask you this: what's next in your research? You had given me a little preview of where this is going, because I in many ways I feel like the research that you're doing here is establishing something, and there's so many directions you can go from here. Where's your interest taking you right now?
Oh, certainly, yeah, and that gives me a great opportunity to talk back to the wide research grant.
All right.
So there's a team of researchers that I'm working with right now that The research is actually in progress, so I'm not going to give a lot of details about it. I'll just kind of give you the high level. Maybe in the future I can come back and give you the details.
There you go.
So what we're looking at here is we're working with a company in India, and this company, what they want to do is they want to increase the gender equity of their workforce. So they have a role that's typically male-dominated, and what they want to do is they want to try to increase gender equity by targeting their referral program. And so basically, how can we get people to refer more women to these jobs? And what they do with their referrals is that they actually embed them into their job applications, because of the particular dynamics of how that company is hiring right now, they're asking job applicants to give them referrals. And it generally seems to be working. So far what we found in the data is that a good number of those people are actually providing referrals. And what we're doing is we're doing a similar intervention here as the longer shortlist intervention, where the typical referral form that they give them, it's digital, but there are lines on it. So it says, please refer to us, the base form says, please refer to us at least 2 people for this job. And what we did was we created a manipulation where we just extended that. So some people saw the form with only 2, asking for only 2 people. Some people saw the form asking for more people. And our prediction here is that we're going to see more gender diversity in the referrals of the people that are using that longer list. We have some preliminary data suggesting that this is the case, but we don't want to hang our hats on it yet. We want to make sure we do this research thoroughly and then come back to you with some solid conclusions.
Great. Okay, well, we'll sit tight for that. But, one thing we can do is to summarize this conversation that we've just had. In short, kind of like the title suggests, make your short list longer in order to combat bias, get the highest quality candidates. Right? I mean, that's effectively what we're recommending here, yes?
Yes, that's what we're recommending here, and I think that it's consistent with just a lot of research on decision making and hiring. Just that generally considering more information is typically a better thing.
Perfecto. So, audience, couple things to check out. Check out Brian's longer shortlist Harvard Business Review article. We've got something that was published in Nature, I think it was. Yep. Nature.com, and also some of the work that's done at Wide. So, if any of this information we've discussed here appeals to you and you can bring it into your toolkit as a hiring manager or an HR pro, definitely do it. This is just the first step, hopefully, for many of you today. Brian Lucas, thank you for joining me in the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.